outstanding King's Guard enforces the rules at Horse Guards. It is here that the iconic King's Guard performs their ceremonial duties, guarding the monarch with a blend of pride, discipline, and unwavering commitment. The Horse Guards are not just soldiers, they are the living symbol of the British monarchy, standing as silent sentinels for all who visit London. Every day, thousands of people from all over the world gather to witness the changing of the guard ceremony. The sight of soldiers in their red uniforms, adorned with black bearskin hats, marching with precision, is a spectacle that has been happening for centuries. Tourists from all walks of life stop to watch, cameras raised, snapping pictures of what they believe to be a moment frozen in time. To many, it's a storybook moment, the essence of British tradition. But behind this scene of grandeur is a world that few understand, the world of the King's Guard. Their duties are not just about standing still or posing for photos. They are about discipline, respect, and tradition. These soldiers are handpicked from the best of the British Army, known for their courage, their sense of honor, and their ability to endure long hours of rigid posture without so much as a flinch. The hours spent on duty under the hot sun or in the biting cold are grueling, but they remain stoic, embodying the strength and resilience of the monarchy itself. Among these guards is one soldier who stands out, a young man named Thomas. Thomas had always admired the Horse Guards as a child. He would visit London with his parents, gazing in awe at the soldiers in their grand uniforms, wishing he could one day wear the red tunic and the towering bearskin hat. Little did he know that he would one day join their ranks and take on the mantle of one of the most respected positions in the British military. Thomas had always felt a sense of duty. He had grown up in a family where service to the country was considered an honor. His grandfather had served in World War II, and his father had been a soldier too. So, when Thomas enlisted in the army at 18, it was almost like following a family tradition. But becoming a part of the Horse Guards was different. It wasn't just about military service. It was about becoming part of something far greater, the living history of the monarchy. His journey to becoming a King's Guard wasn't easy. The selection process was intense, with physical and mental tests that pushed him to his limits. He had to be in peak physical condition, strong enough to carry the weight of the bearskin hat, which itself weighed more than a kilogram. The mental endurance required was even more challenging. For hours, the guards had to remain perfectly still, facing countless distractions from tourists, street performers, and the unpredictable weather. But Thomas knew what was at stake. It was his dream, and he wasn't going to let anything break his concentration. Once he passed the rigorous tests and was selected, Thomas was assigned to the Horse Guards parade. From that moment on, his life changed forever. His days were filled with training, learning how to march in perfect unison, how to sit tall in the saddle while controlling the horse, and how to maintain composure despite the chaotic environment around him. Every detail mattered, from the positioning of the feet to the angle of the head, to ensure that they all presented an image of unwavering discipline. On his first day at the parade, Thomas stood in position, looking out at the crowd of people who gathered to witness the ceremony. They watched in silence, as if the world had stopped turning just to see this display of British pride. Tourists eagerly snapped photos, some even leaning forward to get a closer look at the soldiers. But for Thomas, it wasn't about the people or the photos. His focus was solely on his duty, standing still, keeping his eyes forward and never flinching. The crowds could be overwhelming at times. It was common for visitors to take photos without asking for permission, sometimes getting too close, even trying to touch the horses. But Thomas had been trained to deal with such distractions. The job required him to remain unmoved, unbothered by the distractions that surrounded him. He had learned that the Horse Guards were not just a symbol of tradition, but also of power and control. It was a humbling responsibility, one that required immense self-control. Each time he donned his uniform and stood at attention, Thomas was reminded of the history that stood behind him. He was part of something bigger than himself, a symbol of honor, strength, and tradition. His every move, or lack thereof, reflected the centuries of military discipline that had been passed down from one generation of guards to the next. Despite the pressure, Thomas took pride in his role. He understood that the king's guard was not just about looking impressive for the tourists. It was about serving the country, serving the king, and upholding a tradition that spanned generations. The significance of his role weighed heavily on him, but he also found a sense of purpose in the stillness. It was through this stillness that the guard communicated strength, power, and an unwavering commitment to duty. But it wasn't all routine. There were moments of unpredictability, moments when the calm facade of the horse guards would be tested. Tourists would sometimes push boundaries, either out of ignorance or a lack of respect. And it was in these moments that Thomas had to make a choice. How far should he allow visitors to get away with their behavior? At what point did he need to enforce the rules to preserve the dignity of the horse guards? Thomas often found himself contemplating this question in the quiet moments before his shift began. He had seen how some of his fellow guards would deal with difficult situations. Some would remain silent, letting things slide. Others would firmly step in, maintaining control of the situation without showing any sign of weakness. But for Thomas, he knew that enforcing the rules was just as important as maintaining composure. The horse guards weren't just there to pose for pictures. They were there to represent the strength and legacy of the monarchy. As the days passed, Thomas's commitment to his role deepened. He began to understand the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the red tunic and bearskin hat. It wasn't just about the grandeur of the ceremony. It was about upholding the history and the respect that had been built over centuries. Each day he stood proud, knowing that he was part of something far larger than himself, a tradition that would continue long after he was gone. As he stood still on his post, the wind blowing through his uniform and the sound of the crowd buzzing in the distance, Thomas felt a sense of peace. The pressure to perform was always there, but it was in these quiet moments that he truly understood the meaning of being a part of the horse guards. It wasn't just about the ceremony. It was about the honor of serving the king, the country, and the legacy of the monarchy itself. And so Thomas stood, immovable and unwavering, ready for whatever the next day would bring. With each passing moment, he felt a little more connected to the history around him, a history that would continue to live on through the actions of the king's guard. The morning was bright, with the sun shining down over the horse guards' parade. The sound of the city humming in the distance filled the air, but here, at the heart of the monarchy's ceremonial life, it felt as though time moved more slowly. The guardsmen stood tall in their red uniforms, motionless like statues, each one reflecting the pride and tradition that had been passed down through generations. Thomas adjusted his bearskin hat as he took his place, his eyes focused on the horizon. Today, however, was different. The changing of the guard ceremony had always been an event that attracted large crowds, but this day felt more intense. There was something in the air, a tension that had not been present in the past. It wasn't just the usual tourists that filled the area, eager to snap photos and watch the historic event. There was a large group of foreign visitors, many of them unfamiliar with the rules and customs that govern the horse guards. They were excited, energetic, and at times reckless. Thomas could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he quickly pushed it down. His training had prepared him for moments like this. As a king's guard, his job wasn't just about looking impressive or standing still. It was about upholding the rules, maintaining discipline, and ensuring that the ceremony remained a dignified representation of the British monarchy. Tourists gathered around, chatting excitedly. Some were taking selfies, Others were trying to get as close to the guards as possible. Thomas could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he remained calm. He knew the importance of remaining composed, no matter the distractions. His training had taught him that, no matter what happened around him, he must never flinch, never move out of position, and never let the crowd break his concentration. But today, things began to feel different. A family of tourists approached the guards, excited and eager to take pictures. The father, a man in his mid-40s, tried to position himself closer to one of the horses, his camera held high above his head. He didn't seem to understand the unspoken rule: do not get too close to the horses. The guards weren't there for tourists to use as props for their vacation memories. Thomas watched quietly as the father moved even closer. The horse shifted its weight, slightly uneasy with the proximity. Thomas's instincts kicked in. He couldn't allow this to continue. The crowd, distracted by their own excitement, hadn't noticed the discomfort the horse was showing, but Thomas saw it clearly. He knew he had to intervene before things escalated. With a quick glance at his fellow guards, Thomas stepped forward. His boots clicked against the stone ground, echoing through the courtyard. He stopped just a few feet away from the man, who was now standing far too close to the horse. "Sir," Thomas said, his voice firm but respectful, "I must ask you to step back. Please maintain a safe distance from the horses." The man turned, startled at first, then a look of confusion crossed his face. "Oh, I'm just taking a picture. It'll be fine," he replied dismissively, not understanding the significance of the guard's request. Thomas, never breaking his stance, looked directly into the man's eyes. "I'm sorry, but for your safety, and for the horses, I must insist you step back. The rules must be followed." The man hesitated for a moment, clearly irritated by the interruption. He looked around at the crowd, as though searching for someone to back him up. But the other tourists had either not noticed the interaction or were too busy with their own activities to get involved. The father glanced at Thomas, then at the horse, and after a moment's pause, grudgingly took a few steps back. Thomas stood tall, still unmoving, watching the man carefully to ensure he complied. It wasn't about being rude or impolite. It was about maintaining the integrity of the ceremony, the respect for the horses, and the traditions that had been carried out for centuries. He had done what was necessary to prevent any further disruption. As the tourists continued to take their photos from a safe distance, Thomas turned his attention back to the rest of the crowd. His heart was still racing a little, but he forced himself to remain calm. The moment had passed, but the importance of what he had done lingered in his mind. This was not the first time he had been forced to intervene, but each time it felt just as significant. He wasn't just standing as a guard. He was standing for a set of rules that had been established long before him and would continue long after he was gone. The crowd was growing larger now, more people pressing in to witness the changing of the guard. A group of teenagers began to approach, laughing and joking with one another. One of them, a girl wearing a bright pink jacket, waved her hand in front of one of the guards' faces, trying to get a reaction. She was clearly testing the limits, expecting some kind of response, perhaps a glare or an angry outburst. But Thomas remained unmoved, his eyes locked forward, his body as still as the stone statues surrounding him. The girl's antics continued for a few more seconds before she realized that there was no reaction, no emotional response. She stopped, confused, and turned away. It was moments like these that tested the guard's patience, but Thomas knew better than to give in. The more they ignored the antics, the more they demonstrated their power. He had learned that his silence and composure were the strongest forms of communication. Despite his outward calm, a small part of Thomas was frustrated. It wasn't always easy to stand in the face of such disrespect. He had seen guards in the past break character, snapping at tourists who pushed too hard or acted inappropriately. But those moments, while satisfying in the short term, only hurt the dignity of the horse guards. The strength of the tradition lay in remaining composed, in upholding the rules with grace and authority. As the ceremony continued, Thomas couldn't help but notice the other guards, each one locked in their own battle with the crowd. One of the senior guards, Sergeant Major Clark, was positioned near the center of the parade. He was a veteran of the Horse Guards, with years of experience and an iron will. Despite his years of service, Sergeant Major Clark had the same quiet intensity as the younger guards. His posture never wavered, his eyes never left the horizon, and he commanded a silent respect from the crowd. After the ceremony, once the visitors began to disperse, Thomas walked through the courtyard, his boots clicking against the cobblestone once more. He felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, responsibility not just for the monarchy but for the very tradition that had brought him here. He had done what was required, what was expected of him. But as he looked around at the crowd still buzzing with excitement, he realized that enforcing the rules wasn't just about stopping people from breaking them. It was about teaching respect. That was the true challenge. It wasn't enough to simply stop the tourists from getting too close or making jokes. The real task was to make them understand why these rules existed in the first place. The horse guards were more than just a spectacle. They were a living connection to the history of the monarchy, a reminder of the discipline and dignity that had been present for centuries. And as the day ended, Thomas knew that, despite the frustrations, he was exactly where he needed to be. He had the honor of representing something far greater than himself. The King's Guard wasn't just about standing still. It was about standing for something. And that in itself was worth every moment of quiet resistance. The afternoon sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestones of Horse Guards Parade. The changing of the guard ceremony had ended, and tourists began to drift away, their chatter fading into the distance. But for Thomas and the other guards, the day was far from over. Their duties were far more than just ceremonial. They were the living embodiment of tradition, and their presence was required throughout the day. As the crowd thinned, Thomas remained at his post, his boots planted firmly on the ground. His eyes scanned the area, watching as people slowly started to return to their activities, some going to nearby museums, others simply enjoying the bustling atmosphere of London. But there was something unsettling about the moment. Though the crowd had cleared, a few individuals lingered, as if they couldn't quite let go of the spectacle they had just witnessed. One of the lingering groups was a family, standing near the edge of the parade ground. They were quiet now, but Thomas could tell they hadn't quite finished soaking in the moment. The father, a tall man with a wide grin, was waving his phone in the air, trying to capture another photo of the guards. His wife was adjusting the clothing of their young daughter, while their teenage son stood nearby, staring at Thomas with an odd expression. He looked almost as if he was studying him, trying to figure out if the guard could move or blink. Thomas had encountered many tourists during his time on duty, but there was something about this group that felt different. They were polite enough, but there was an air of curiosity mixed with disregard. The father's camera clicked, and Thomas could hear the distinct sound of the shutter as he attempted to take another close-up shot of one of the horses. Thomas didn't move, his gaze fixed firmly ahead, just as he had been trained. But the sound of the camera shutter was becoming increasingly annoying. He knew he couldn't just ignore it forever, and the longer he stood there, the more it began to feel like a personal challenge. It wasn't just the intrusion of their camera lens that bothered him, it was the lack of understanding behind it. The tourists didn't see the full picture. To them, the horse guards were just a part of the London experience, something to be captured in a photo, shared online and forgotten about. But to Thomas and his fellow guards, it was far more than that. They were standing for something: the history of the monarchy, the respect for tradition, and the dignity of the horses they cared for. These weren't just objects of decoration. They were symbols of strength and pride, and they deserved to be treated with the same respect. He shifted slightly, catching the father's attention. The man raised an eyebrow and took another photo, this time closer than before, almost as if testing Thomas's limits. He didn't seem to realize that he had crossed a line. The guards were meant to be seen but never touched, never provoked. Thomas could feel the heat rise in his chest again, but he held it back. It was moments like these that tested him, pushed him to the edge. He could feel the frustration bubbling inside him, but he also knew that responding in anger would only ruin the dignity of the horse guards. His father had taught him that anger never solves anything. It only makes things worse. The teenage son finally spoke up, his voice breaking the silence. "Dad, why don't you just ask him to smile?" he said with a teasing grin. "It's like he's a statue." The father laughed, but Thomas remained stone-faced. He had heard similar remarks countless times before, each one designed to provoke, to test whether or not the guards would break their composure. It was an unwelcome challenge that had become all too familiar. Thomas had to remind himself that it was all part of the job, part of the responsibility he had taken on when he joined the king's guard. "Can you get any closer to the horses?" the son asked next, pointing at the horse standing beside him. The question wasn't meant to be malicious, but it revealed the lack of understanding that plagued many visitors. People treated the horses like props, as though they were part of a show rather than living beings that deserved respect. Thomas stepped forward, breaking his silence. His voice was calm but firm. "Sir," he said, addressing the father, "I must insist that you do not approach the horses any closer. It is for your safety and for the horses' safety as well. Please respect the boundaries we have set." The father looked momentarily surprised. He had been expecting a polite request, but the firmness in Thomas's tone made it clear that he wasn't joking. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of discomfort in the father's eyes. He glanced at his son, then back at Thomas, realizing that he couldn't simply ignore the guard's request. Slowly, he lowered his camera and stepped back, pulling his family with him. Thomas's posture didn't change, and he didn't allow himself to show any signs of relief. His job was far from over, and he had done exactly what was required of him. Still, the encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth. It wasn't the family's fault. They didn't know the rules, and many tourists didn't fully understand the role of the horse guards. But the lack of respect, the casual disregard for the boundaries that were there to protect both the horses and the guards, was something Thomas struggled to accept. He glanced over at Sergeant Major Clark, who stood a little farther along the parade ground. The senior guard had witnessed the entire interaction but hadn't moved a muscle. His eyes were calm, his face unreadable. Sergeant Major Clark had seen it all before. He was a veteran, someone who had dealt with far worse than a few tourists testing the limits. Thomas knew that Sergeant Major Clark would offer no words of reassurance, but that was part of the lesson. The strength of the horse guards wasn't in their ability to react, but in their ability to remain composed, to endure the little provocations with silent dignity. As the family walked away, their attention shifting to something else, Thomas allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. But the rest of the day stretched ahead, filled with more of the same. There would be more tourists, more questions, and more challenges to face. Some would be respectful, and some would push the boundaries. But no matter what, Thomas had to remain true to his duty. The rest of the afternoon passed in relative quiet, but the tension from the earlier incident lingered in the back of Thomas's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was always more at stake than just following the rules. It was about setting an example, about showing the world that the horse guards were more than just a spectacle. They were a living part of history, a reminder of the strength and dignity that had defined the British monarchy for centuries. As the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, Thomas stood at his post, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The crowds had left, but the day's events had made him realize something important. His role as a king's guard wasn't just about standing still. It was about standing for something greater: the history, the tradition, and the honor of the monarchy itself. And no matter how many tourists came and went, no matter how many challenges he faced, he would continue to stand firm, unwavering in his commitment to that duty. The day had been long, and the tension that had built up earlier still lingered in the air. Thomas had dealt with several more groups of tourists, each one posing its own small challenge. But despite the distractions, he remained focused on his duty. The Horse Guards parade was quiet now, with only a few late visitors milling around, but his mind kept replaying the moments of earlier. The challenge of keeping his composure, the responsibility of enforcing the rules. It was all part of his job, but that didn't make it any easier. As he stood tall, his boots planted firmly on the cobblestones, he couldn't help but notice the flickering shadows around him. The low hum of traffic from the city beyond the gates seemed distant now, replaced by the subtle creaks of the horses shifting their weight or the occasional gust of wind. It was peaceful in its own way, but there was an underlying energy that Thomas could feel in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just the constant scrutiny of the tourists, it was something more. From his position, he could see Sergeant Major Clark, the senior guard, walking toward him. The older man's stride was steady, his hands behind his back in the practiced manner of someone who had been on duty far longer than Thomas. Clark had been with the Horse Guards for nearly 2 decades. He had seen it all, and he had the air of someone who had mastered the balance between tradition and the challenges of modern-day visitors. "Thomas," Sergeant Major Clark called, his voice deep and calm. "A word." Thomas nodded, straightening up in respect. "Yes, Sergeant Major." The older man stopped beside him, giving him a quick, once-over glance. There was no judgment in his eyes, but something about the way Clark observed him made Thomas feel as though he were being weighed, measured. The silence between them stretched for a moment before Clark spoke again. "You did well today," he said simply, his voice still as steady as ever. Thomas blinked in surprise. "Thank you, Sergeant Major, but I couldn't help but feel frustrated with the tourists today. Some of them just don't understand the importance of what we do here." Clark chuckled softly, a sound that didn't match the weight of his years of experience. "Frustration is part of the job, Thomas. You'll get used to it, but don't let it cloud your duty. The public sees what they want to see. They don't understand the work we put in. They just want to see the horses, the uniforms, the ceremony. But we're more than that." Thomas nodded, taking in the words. He had heard similar advice from his fellow guardsmen, but hearing it from Sergeant Major Clark made it feel more real, more significant. The duty he carried wasn't just about standing still or looking impressive. It was about something deeper, something that couldn't be explained in a photo or a quick glance. "Remember, the more they push, the more you need to stand firm," Clark continued. "We represent something that goes beyond today, beyond this moment. It's about the history, the legacy. And no matter how many people try to break your focus, you stand tall. You stand for more than just yourself." Thomas felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had been struggling with the constant distractions, the tourists who crossed the line, and the pressure to maintain perfect discipline. But now, with Clark's words settling in, he began to see his role differently. It wasn't about winning every small battle or proving himself in every interaction. It was about maintaining the integrity of the Horse Guards, and through that, the monarchy itself. The conversation lingered in the air, and Thomas thought about how much he had already learned in his time as a king's guard. At first, it had felt like just another job, a prestigious job, yes, but still a job. But now, he saw the responsibility that came with it. The patience, the dignity, the silent pride. Every move, every action, even every word carried meaning. And the way he carried himself, the way he stood as a representative of the monarchy, had far-reaching consequences. Sergeant Major Clark broke his gaze, looking toward the horizon. You'll see. It's not about how the public perceives you. It's about how you hold yourself, how you carry the tradition forward. You'll have days like today where things test you, but that's when you'll grow. Thomas could feel the weight of the older guard's words sinking in. There would always be tourists pushing boundaries. There would always be moments of frustration. But as Clark had said, these were the moments that tested him, not just as a guard, but as someone tasked with carrying forward a centuries-old tradition. "Thanks, Sergeant Major," Thomas replied, feeling more at peace with himself than he had earlier in the day. The advice wasn't new, but hearing it from Clark gave it a weight he hadn't fully understood until now. Clark gave a small nod, his gaze turning back toward the parade ground. "Keep your head up, Thomas. You're doing well. You'll find your rhythm." As Clark walked away, Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. The frustration he had been feeling earlier seemed to fade into the background. The tourists might never fully understand the role of the King's Guard, but that wasn't his concern. His concern was upholding the rules, keeping the tradition alive, and doing his duty with honor. The rest of the evening passed with relative calm. The streets around the Horse Guards parade grew quieter, the hum of the city growing faint. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the stone walls, and Thomas took a moment to appreciate the stillness that had settled over the area. The day's events, the encounters with the tourists, were behind him now. The weight of his duty still rested on his shoulders, but he now understood it in a new light. As the shadows lengthened, Thomas stood at his post, his back straight, his eyes fixed forward. He was no longer just a guard. He was part of something far greater, something that had endured for generations and would continue long after he was gone. The Horse Guards were more than just soldiers in uniform. They were the embodiment of history, tradition, and respect. And it was his responsibility to carry that legacy forward, one still moment at a time. But the job was never truly done. There would always be another day, another tourist, another challenge to face. Yet, with the wisdom imparted by Sergeant Major Clark, Thomas felt ready. He stood firm, as he always had, but now with a deeper understanding of the responsibility that lay within him. And so, as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Thomas remained at his post, unwavering, a symbol of strength, discipline, and the enduring legacy of the Horse Guards. The evening had come, and the Horse Guards parade was bathed in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. The crowds had long since departed, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the city in the distance. The horses, now relaxed after the day's duties, stood still as their guards continued to remain on watch. The sense of calm was almost surreal compared to the chaos of earlier in the day. For Thomas, the day had been a series of small battles, testing his patience, his focus, and his resolve. But now, as he stood silently at his post, the weight of the responsibility seemed both lighter and heavier at the same time. His mind wandered back to the moments of frustration, the tourists who had tested him, and the quiet strength he had tried to show in the face of disrespect. He felt the lingering presence of Sergeant Major Clark's words, echoing in his mind like a mantra. "It's not about how the public perceives you. It's about how you hold yourself." As the last rays of sunlight began to fade, Thomas saw a figure approaching from the distance, a tall man dressed in a formal uniform, walking with purpose. It was the king's representative, the royal officer who occasionally visited the guards to check on their performance. Thomas straightened, his posture sharp and his gaze focused forward. His heart skipped a beat, though he would never let it show. These visits were rare, and they often came with a sense of tension. It was hard to shake the feeling that, though his duty had been clear all along, this would be the moment where he would be truly judged. The officer's footsteps grew louder as he approached, his eyes scanning the parade ground with an experienced gaze. He was a man of few words, known for his sharp eye and his ability to notice even the smallest imperfection. Thomas knew the importance of this visit. If the officer found any mistake, it would reflect on the entire regiment. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the legacy of the Horse Guards, the monarchy, and the centuries of tradition that they embodied. When the officer finally reached Thomas, he didn't speak at first. Instead, he gave a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement, his gaze lingering on Thomas's posture, his uniform, and the way he held himself. It was a moment of quiet evaluation, and for a brief second, Thomas felt as though time itself had stopped. "Guard," the officer said, his voice calm but firm, "you've performed well today." Thomas's heart raced, but his face remained stoic, just as it should. He gave a sharp nod in return. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice steady. The officer took another moment to observe the parade ground, his eyes moving over the horses and the other guards in the distance. "You handled the situation with the tourists well. You enforced the rules as expected. It's not always easy, is it?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He had learned that silence often spoke louder than words, especially when in the presence of someone as seasoned as this officer. He simply nodded, acknowledging the truth in the officer's statement. It wasn't easy. But then again, few things worth doing were ever easy. The officer's gaze shifted back to Thomas. The king expects nothing less than the highest standard, and the public, well, they don't always understand the purpose of the Horse Guards. But you, he paused for a moment, you've demonstrated the strength of this institution. You've shown what it means to serve, not just with duty but with pride. A feeling of pride swelled in Thomas's chest. His shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. The words of praise from such an esteemed officer meant more than he could express. For the first time that day, he felt a sense of relief, the burden of the constant scrutiny he faced lifting just a little. He had done his job well. The officer gave one last glance toward the parade ground before speaking again. "Remember this feeling, guard. In the face of all challenges, remember that you are not just a soldier. You are the embodiment of tradition, the keeper of history." The Horse Guards are more than just a ceremonial display. They are the guardians of a legacy that has endured for centuries. Do not forget that, even on the hardest days. With those final words, the officer turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. Thomas watched him go, standing still as he had been trained. The officer's visit had lasted only a few minutes, but the impact of his words would stay with him far longer. As the officer disappeared into the distance, Thomas turned his gaze back to the parade ground. The soft evening breeze ruffled his uniform, but it didn't distract him. His focus remained unwavering, the lessons of the day settling into his mind. The tourists, the frustrations, the challenges, all of it had been part of the journey. But the journey wasn't over. His role as a king's guard would continue, and with it, the responsibility to uphold the legacy of the monarchy, to stand as a silent sentinel, and to enforce the rules with dignity. The sun had set now, and the first stars began to appear in the sky. The world around him seemed to slow, the noises of the city dimming as the evening deepened. But Thomas stood tall, his eyes scanning the horizon. The night had come, but his duty had not ended. It never truly did. As he stood there, lost in the quiet of the evening, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led him to this point. He had come a long way since the first day he had donned the red tunic and the bearskin hat. He had faced moments of frustration, moments of doubt, but he had also experienced moments of great pride. His time as a king's guard had already shaped him in ways he hadn't anticipated. More than anything, Thomas understood now that being part of the Horse Guards was more than just a role. It was a calling, a responsibility that went far beyond the uniform and the ceremony. It was about honoring the history, the tradition, and the institution that had been built over centuries. It was about standing, unwavering in the face of the modern world, no matter how much it changed. And it was about carrying the legacy of those who had come before him, ensuring that it remained strong and true for those who would follow. Thomas straightened his back once more, his eyes scanning the area around him. He was ready for whatever came next. His duty, his pride, and his sense of purpose were stronger than ever. He was a king's guard, and that meant more than anything. It was more than just standing still. It was about standing for something far greater. The night stretched on, and Thomas stood at his post, resolute, a symbol of strength and tradition, ready for whatever the next day would bring.